Check one, two, three. Hey everybody, it's Michael Helms, also known as Michael the Sound Guy, and this is the Location Sound Podcast. You know, each episode we talk with location sound mixers, boom ops, and other industry pros about the various aspects of recording sound on location, whether it's for feature and independent films, TV commercials, interviews, any time where dialogue from actors is recorded. I started my career in the recording studios in New York City with some of the big artists back in the day, and later on projects for networks like HBO, Sci-Fi Channel, and the Cartoon Network. As time went by, I got out of the studio and began working in production sound. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just starting out, thanks for joining us. Okay, my guest today is a production sound mixer based out of New Orleans, Louisiana. Please welcome Chris Welcker.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Chris, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We've kind of this past year discussed a little bit about what's going on with COVID and how it affected you. I guess, where were you when COVID shut down what you were working on?
First time that I had heard of COVID and it had any effect on me, I was finishing up a job called Deep Water, and I was shooting from the end of last year and going into the new year. And I had ordered for some things to give away to people on the set. I had ordered some buttons. They were like these enamel pins. And they were coming from a company that I guess sourced them in China. And I kind of waited till the last second to do this. And so I was really worried that they weren't going to make it in time. And as I was following the tracking and everything, it was like, where are these things currently, sitting? And it turned out that they hadn't been produced yet because they were in, I guess, China, Wuhan, or, who knows. But it was funny because, I'm like, these things are not going to make it. And I'm typing emails to the company like, I need these to be here. You said they would be here by this particular time. That's why I went with your company. And they were like, well, there's this thing going on in China right now. And I was like, well, of course, there's always things going on. But I really need these buttons, to come in. If they come in 2 weeks late, then it's like, it's too late. Cut to all of a sudden there's this pandemic, and it's like, oh, okay, so now the rest of the world shut down and I'm worried about these buttons, and it's kind of silly. Then beyond that, I had a job that was supposed to start, I guess, in April last year. I got an email from the line producer saying, we're going to shut down, and I started hearing from all these other movies in the area that they were shutting down, and we kind of thought, it'll be like 2 weeks, and then we'll get started again. And then we got an email from, it was a Netflix show, and they actually were kind enough to pay all of us for several weeks, which was really great. They didn't have to do that, and it kind of extended the amount of unemployment and stuff that a lot of people that, were on that crew were getting.
So you kind of had inside information about the pandemic.
Yeah, it was like, then I got the buttons in, the job was over, and I'm sitting, in my courtyard area, and I'm just like, drinking wine at 5 p.m. every day, happy hour with my wife, and the buttons come in, and it's just, I'm like, well, do I even want to open this? It's like, it says, it's like hazmat suit sort of thing. Like, I'm not sure if I want to even hand these out. They're all like individually ziplocked, and, is this the sort of thing that you want to give, to the people that you care about, that you worked with?
That's crazy, man. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's in your audio kit. So you're a production sound mixer. So kind of walk us through your gear, your setup, and all the goodies.
I guess I have a couple different setups. I've been kind of building a bigger cart. That's kind of my primary cart for when I'm doing, if I'm doing stuff on a stage. So that is based around a Sound Devices Scorpio. I also have a smaller cart that's for more of like when you do driving shots, or if you're doing something where you need a smaller footprint. In those situations, I end up switching over to a Sound Devices 833. Outside of that, the receivers are all electro-based. I have the SRBs, SRCs. I primarily run out of a bag. Even though I'm on a cart, a lot of times I'll have my bag on the cart. That way it gives me the ability to kind of be more modular. So I'll pull the receivers out of one setup and put them onto another one. Recently, I got the SL2 from Sound Devices. And so, again, being able to take those receivers and pull them out of one system and then put them into another one keeps things pretty consistent, so I can keep using the same transmitters and based on the needs of that particular shoot, I'll pull one or two receivers and then have the ability to, serve the needs of that particular job.
You've been happy with the 8 series?
Yeah, I've been pretty happy with it. At first, I think it was a little concern that you don't want to be the earliest adopter with something like that because, you want I had the 788 before that. So it felt like the 788 was very stable and you can predict if it was going to have any kind of problems or anything like that, you knew exactly how to deal with them when they would come up. And it was very rare that I would have a problem. But with the new system, it's kind of like, well, if the machine freezes, what do I do? Do I have to hold a button, rub my head with one hand, pat my stomach with the other, So you just kind of don't really know at the beginning. And so I was a little hesitant to jump on too early with it, but I started getting, a sense from a bunch of message boards and things that people were really saying that it was starting to get very stable. So I made the switch to that.
All right. Well, what kind of mics do you like to use?
Primarily, we've switched over to DPAs. I'd say most of the stuff we do is on DPAs. So I have, for my main shotgun, I have the DPA 4017. I have the 4018 capsule. For lavaliers, we use the 4060s, the 4061s, the 6060s. I used to use the Sennheiser MKH50s. I was very happy with them for a long time. But once I switched over to the DPAs, they have a certain characteristic that I feel is a little less hyped, I'd say. It feels like when you use an MKH50 on an actor that has a really good sounding voice, the voice can sound great. It can be very boomy and it almost sounds like a finished product, like you're watching an action movie. And that's nice. But I felt like when I switched to the 4017 and the 4018, it just kind of evened out. It got a little smoother sounding. And that was really nice. It was easier on my ears listening all day.
And what do you like to use for timecode?
Primarily the Denicky slates. I have the TSC, the TS3, I believe. So I have 2 of the full-sized ones and then one of the mini ones. For lockets, I use the Tentacle Syncs.
Now, what kind of cart do you have?
I have the Magliner Junior with the shelf on it for my main cart. And then I also have the Super Zuka cart for whenever I'm doing smaller things where I need to be a little more mobile.
Have you been happy with the Super Zuka?
I've been very happy with it. Yeah, it's amazing how it allows me to really get places that I wouldn't normally think I could get. It's very narrow and it's very compact. I can fit it in the back of my vehicle. I was just recently doing a job out in a lot of exterior locations, woods and swamps and things like that. And we were basically to get to the locations where we were shooting from where, the transportation department had the gear. We had to go through ATVs, gators. And so being able to just pick it up and throw it in the back of the gator, strap it to 2 points there, and then load up the rest of the stuff into the back of that little tailgate, it was like a lifesaver. It was really great. And then when they decide we want to shoot over here, and next thing you know, they're the light's changing and we need to shoot over here now. And it's like a complete 180. You have all these cables going to all these different places and people have found their perfect spot where they want to live. And it's they don't want to move. So having the ability to, if there's tree roots and things like that, having the ability to really maneuver around all that stuff without too much trouble is really nice and makes it to where you can spend more time, having conversations with people instead of figuring out where you're going to, put your cart and trying to stay put. That creates a lot of tension to people.
I actually have a Zuka cart on order. It's not a Super Zuka, but I was going to try my hand at customizing myself. I'm actually working on a short film right now for, it's a local production, and we're going to be out in the woods next week. So hopefully it's going to get here in time. But I was like, I don't want to, have to drag everything through. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. I think, another thing, it's not quite a cart, but I recently purchased this backpack rig from K-Tech. And we were working in mountainous kind of terrain as well on this last job. And it didn't seem like that cart was going to even, as good as it was to get around, there were certain restrictions for these locations where it didn't make sense to do that either. So everything essentially was going to have to be hiked in and carried by hand or by your back. So that actually came in really handy. You could put it on your back. It's basically a backpack that has a little compartment for a bag rig. and you can throw it inside of there and strap it in, and then just put it on your back and walk up to, wherever you have to go. That was pretty handy too, so you might want to take a look at those.
Will that fit in the Zuka?
No, it's kind of a either or situation for me, but it holds a decent amount of stuff when you think about like all the things that you need for, doing the mixing part of the job. And then it keeps your hands free to carry other things.
All right. Now, do you have any other gadgets or peripherals on your cart that you like?
I've got a lot of little things that I've come up with here and there. I have quite a few iPads that serve for different things. One of them, more recently, it seems like the script pages for the day's work, they're going digital. And so being able to like have your script in front of you and being able to, typically on a film set, I would cut up my script pages and I would highlight them and, try to tape them together so that you could see the whole scene. Now that they're going digital, it's like, well, you can't, you'd have to have multiple iPads like stacked on top of each other. So I got this little foot controller that's made for musicians, and it's pretty great because like you can easily highlight your pages, your characters and stuff, so you can see who's who, and I coordinate that with my faders on my control surface, and then use the foot pedal while I'm mixing to advance the page. So that's kind of a neat little extra thing. And a lot of times people, they're like, what is that thing? Is that a whammy pedal? Is it like, they don't know what it is, and so like a tap in, it's kind of a fun thing to show people.
That's cool. What software do you use for scripts?
Scriptation, and then the foot pedal program is called Fourscore.
Okay. Yeah, I've used Scriptation, and I love it because you go in there and you could just, if the script is formatted properly, you can go in there, pick your characters, pick your color, and then it just highlights the whole, everybody. And I love that.
Yeah.
And then if there's changes, you don't have to go back through and highlight it. And you can highlight it manually too, but I love that stuff.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
It definitely makes things easier. I mean, I would run out of ink in those highlighters after a period of time. So now it's like you can kind of do your whole script at once and have all your notes there in one place. And so then if you look at the day's work, you can kind of see, I remember I wrote a note about like there's music playback this day, or like there's something about that location. So it's kind of nice to not have to spend all that time each day redoing. You could do it one time and save yourself minutes, that you can do other things that day.
All right, cool. All right, let's talk about some of the projects you've worked on. Let's see. You did Keanu with Keegan, Michael Key, and Jordan Peele. How was that?
It was really fun. I mean, those guys are hilarious, and getting the opportunity to work on that was probably my first big mixing job. So it was really a great way to get into it. Starting with that as my real first job, it was like a great combination of comedy and a good cast. So it was really fun.
Yeah, a little bit of action in there too.
Yeah, they had a good bit of action. There was actually a lot of driving stuff that was, challenging, but yeah, it was very rewarding.
Was most of that on a process rig?
No, actually, they did a good combination of free driving and process trailer. I'd say most of it was actually free driving. They had, I believe they call it a pod car. That's where they put the guts of what makes the car drive on top of the vehicle, and they have a stunt person that's actually doing the driving, and then they have the actors pretending like they're driving, and the steering wheel just can go either direction and has no control over the actual car, so that they can just focus on, doing the acting part of it. And since it was kind of like reckless driving, you need somebody that's really in control that can allow the actors to just kind of be silly and do their thing. And then there was this one scene that was pretty funny where Keegan, he was driving kind of like a Honda Civic with like the big muffler and everything. And it was a stick shift, and he actually had to learn how to drive the stick shift. And, the gag is that as he's like missing the gear and, revving the car, it's just going crazy, and the loud engine, the loud muffler and everything adds to the comedy. It was pretty funny. So, in a situation like that, it was fun for us because that was really part of the joke, is like him driving that car. And how ridiculous that car was that, it had that loud muffler. So we definitely like put a microphone outside of the car just to, capture the sound of that muffler from outside.
So how did you guys mic up the car? What was the miking setup?
To do the car for the exterior, I had a Cub mic. It's like a Sanken like Cub. I forget the exact model, but used some Joe's sticky stuff to attach it to the exterior of the car near the muffler. And then had this big piece of fur. It was like an old Rycoat wind sock or whatever that was no good. And I just cut it up and then kind of put that over the top of it. Funny story about that was there was one point where the director, he was I think he was a little stressed about the day. You know, he was not quite making the day as much as he would have liked. And he looked over at me, and I asked my boom operator at the time if he could go and get a paper plate. And he got this paper plate for me, and we had the paper tape and stuff like that. And I cut the paper plate in half and basically made like a little spoiler so that, because the wind was still hitting that mic and kind of ruining the sound of it. So I basically like taped this paper plate to the side of the car to just block the wind so it wouldn't hit this microphone. And the director, he looks over at me and he's like, what the hell is this? Like, what are we doing? Like, we're not even making our day, and this guy's over here taping a paper plate to the side of the car. I was like, what is this? And I was like, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. We're not waiting on sound, the classic, like, we're waiting on sound thing. I think he's just looking at me like, is this what we're waiting for? And it's like, no, they're still rigging the camera onto the front of the car, so we ended up, getting him to just like ignore us, and just focus on the fact that everybody's doing their thing and nothing's being held up. And then I remember after like the dailies came through for that day's work, he was like, man, that was really like, I remember looking at what you guys were doing and thinking, this is ridiculous. What are these guys doing? And then I heard it and it was like, wow, it really worked. And I thought that this was going to be a whole ADR scene, and it ended up being really great. So it was kind of a nice thing. I just wish that had happened earlier in the shoot so that he would have had more confidence early on.
Yeah. That's cool. Now, what did you do for the interior of the car?
For that, I had some DPA 4061s. At that point, I only had 2 of those lavaliers. I think I just put those like in the visor. I don't think it was Bumblebee at the time, but I had like a little wind protection on that and just taped it up to the top of the visor so it's, a few inches from the actor's mouth. Another weird thing about that particular, mainly with Keegan, is his voice is so dynamic. He can really belt out notes or like, some volume that can ruin, your gain staging. So at one point I had to figure out how, and because you're in a car too, it just seemed like it was even louder. So I really had to have, at some point I realized I needed an additional microphone in there just to take all that loud volume for those times when he would do that. So at some point I actually used an SM57 that I had and just had that plugged in down low on, like near the shifter, and just in case, And funny enough too, we also had to put, I had a specialty cable made that would take the lavalier that we had on him and it would split it into 2 TA5 connectors. And so I ended up putting 2 transmitters on him, and he would wear both of them on his ankle, and I had them both set to different gains just to, because he was consistently going from loud to quiet.
Yeah, nice ideas there. So how were you monitoring them while they were filming?
To do that, I know a lot of people probably prefer throwing a bag in the car and just hitting record. In that situation, because it was a lot of free driving, it might have been a good solution to that, but I like the ability to actually mix even when you're doing free drive stuff. And so I ended up putting some shark fins on the top of a van. We had like basically a chase van, and the focus pullers were in there. We had a DIT who had put his entire cart in the back of the van. And I had my bag rig in that van as well, and antenna cables so that we could put the shark fins on top. And then we were able to chase the vehicle around. And then for all my transmitters, I had these magnetic mount antenna mounts, and they were made by Vark Audio. And so basically I would remote the antennas to outside of the car. Especially in those cases where there was like the pod car driver, he was so high up on top of the car that I was able to mount them above him. And so, it's basically like a double-decker car at that point. And so the antennas were at the highest point on his vehicle. So even as they're like weaving in between other cars and stuff like that, there's pretty much line of sight between the 2 vehicles.
Nice. So good signal all the way?
Yeah. I mean, you'd occasionally get dropouts if they got way far away, but typically I found that the video people had problems, the camera department had problems before sound did. You end up getting a stunt driver to drive that van so that they can keep up with the actors.
Okay. So that's fun too, right?
Yeah. Kind of really need to put your seatbelt on or just like, hold on.
Yeah, I worked on a project recently, and it's not out yet, but it's a whole thing where he went 201 miles per hour in this car, and I had to do a bag drop, and I'm like, having to set levels, and I'm like, how loud is it going to be? And we only had basically it was one or two passes. The second pass, they had blown half the engine, so the first pass was it. So I was like, there was no way to adjust. So it all turned out pretty good, but that's nerve wracking when you have to do a bag drop and you don't know how loud it's going to get in there.
Yeah, I feel like if I were in that same kind of situation again, if I had to think about doing a bag drop, I would probably, I mean, at that point, it was like my first job, so I didn't have the gear that I have now to be able to do a lot more. Then, it's like I had to make the choice, do I do a bag drop or do I want to have the wireless car-to-car scenario? And I felt it was more important to me to be able to have control over what was being mixed at the time. And again, the director, he kind of thought early on that was all going to be ADR'd anyway. I guess he set the bar so low that, you just hope that you could deliver something much better than that. But nowadays, I think if I was in that same kind of situation, I would probably have a redundant sort of recording system in the car and then still do it the way that I did before, do the wireless car-to-car.
Yeah, that's a great idea to be able to mix it live.
And then you'd have the security of having like a hard-lined recording, that's in the car if you needed it.
Okay. All right, let's see. The Dirt. It's a film about Motley Crue. So what was that about?
It was an interesting one. It was, it was basically like a biopic of the band. They made a book about it as well that I think probably spurred everything to be made. Yeah, it's a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's about as raunchy as they come. The director was Jeff Tremaine, who's the guy he's behind all the Jackass stuff. He did a lot of the Jackass shows, and he did all those Johnny Knoxville movies and stuff like that. Really interesting guy. But like, it seemed like throughout the shoot, they were definitely trying to get into the characters from a very real standpoint. You'd hear stories of what was happening after they called rap. The actors were going out to bars and just living the real Tommy Lee, Nikki Sixx lifestyle.
Interesting. Now, was there a lot of live music recording there, or is it more just playback?
It was mostly playback. I think one of the guys, Ewan, who was one of the guys from the Game of Thrones show, he was the only real musician. Well, I take that back. I'm sorry. Machine Gun Kelly. He played Tommy Lee in this movie. He's a real musician as well, but I don't know if he's really a drummer, but he played Tommy Lee in that movie, and he actually did really, really well. Like, he was definitely really playing, but luckily we weren't doing live records. It was all playback. But it definitely helped, I think, sell the idea that, he was playing to that playback. He was having to hit those drums, hit the cymbals in time, and he looked pretty good. Ewan, he was playing Mick Mars. He's actually a musician and does play guitar, so that helped as well. And then the other guys, it's like when you're singing, you can kind of cover your mouth a little bit with the, on the microphone and kind of fake it.
Yeah. Now, kind of walk us through, some of our listeners, when it comes to playback, they maybe haven't done that yet. And so kind of what's your playback setup?
So back then, it was basically like they would give us these pre-records that they had done. We had the ability to basically dial up or down any of the instruments. So it was a multi-track Pro Tool session. And my boom operator, Ryan Ferris, he and I actually are musicians, and we used to play shows together. He's got a very strong music recording background. And so when we would have playback days, he would become the playback operator, and we would bring in another boom operator or bump the utility person up to boom and bring in a new utility person. And so he was very good at, like, because he's a drummer as well, he knows, some of the difficulties when it comes to what a drummer might need. And Machine Gun Kelly, he plays these big stadium tours. So his hearing, it's like he needed a little more gain than, most people, and he really needed something that he could latch onto in terms of tempo. So being able to kind of give him more drums in the mix and Then, you have like a vocalist that really needs to be able to hear the vocals. It's like you're basically creating these different mixes on stage for these different actors. And so having those pre-records and having them all be isolated different tracks gives us that flexibility to kind of dial in and out different mixes for each actor on their stage monitor. In a couple cases, we would give them in-ear monitors as well, and that way you could kind of dial in just what they wanted.
Okay. Now, it's coming out of a Pro Tools session. What are you coming out into? So is it a laptop you have there, or what do you have?
Yeah, Ryan, his setup, he uses a laptop that he's then able to send to me a mix that includes time code so that, when he hits play, there's an audio time code channel that I get so that post-production is able to then kind of sync everything up to the Pro Tools session. And so I'm recording that in just basically a mono mix of the music, and that's their reference point. He has multiple outputs on his audio interface that he can then feed to the different monitors. So, if he needed, anywhere from 4 to like 8, 16 different outputs, different mixes, he's able to do that.
Okay. Now, I saw you had a nice article with Bumblebee Industries talking about using earwigs versus their new Sidekick. So kind of tell us a little bit about that setup. For this particular project, I guess, were you using earwigs?
Well, I think for the Dirt, we didn't really use earwigs so much because it was a lot of live concert stuff. So we were able to just use floor monitors primarily. But when those came into play, it was on Bill and Ted Face the Music. We started having to do these scenes where we would have dialogue that would happen as well as music playback. And so in order to preserve the dialogue, you may think like, well, let me use earwigs and, but then all of a sudden you have, 14 different people that need to be able to hear this music, and you need to preserve the dialogue that's happening. What ends up happening in that kind of situation is you think, well, we'll have to get 14 earwigs. And then when you start showing the production manager, like, this is what it's going to cost to rent 14 earwigs, and we're going to be doing this for half the movie, then it's like, they start to panic. And so they're like, we can't afford, 14 earwigs for half the show. It's like $100 per earwig, and you'd think like, well, it's a big film, so I don't know what to say, but let me look for some options. And so I started looking around, and I found that the Sidekick that Bumblebee had just come out with, it seemed like looking at these actors' hair and the way that they were going to be costumed, it seemed like a real option. So we ordered a couple of them. I talked to the guys over there about sending me a couple of demos, And so I showed different people on the crew, like the director primarily. I showed him that I was wearing it, and as you can see, I'm bald. You would think it would be harder to hide on somebody with no hair. But they actually fit pretty snugly around the back of your skull, and you can hardly see the little tube that goes from like over your ear into your ear canal. And so I just put it on. I was like pretty impressed at how, nearly invisible it was. And I showed the director, and he was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, check this out. And he's like, what am I looking at? And I was like, exactly. It's like, you can't even see it. And I turned around, and I was like, this is that thing I was telling you about that's going to allow us to have the isolation for the music playback without, the cost associated with earwigs. And he's like, sold. Get them, so we basically had a bunch of those that we were able to use whenever we needed them.
Cool. Yeah, let's talk more about Bill and Ted Face the Music. So this was kind of a long time coming movie. I think in one of the articles you mentioned that was one of your favorite movies, or it was one of those movies you watched growing up. I remember that too. So. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, it was definitely one of my favorite movies growing up, which I'm not like this sort of film buff that's, for that to be at the top of my list, maybe that says something about me. I don't know. But regardless, it was definitely something I was very excited about. I had heard that it was potentially coming to New Orleans. I did everything that I could to try to figure out who I know that's working on this thing from an early standpoint. I figured too, it's got to have a lot of music playback. So I thought, well, having worked on The Dirt and doing a lot of music playback on that movie, that should, at least give them some confidence that we know what we're doing. So it turns out that I actually worked with the production manager on that job many years earlier. And I sent him an email, and I was like, hey, I heard you're coming to New Orleans to do Bill and Ted Face the Music. And he immediately responded, and I'm sure, again, going back to the budget, he probably was like, well, this guy's early in his career. We can probably get him, to work for our budget. And I was like, whatever it takes. This is like a dream job for me. So luckily I didn't have to actually do it for nothing. But yeah, it was definitely one of those scenarios where I was motivated.
Yeah, nice. Well, what were some of the miking challenges on that?
I'd say two of the scenes that were probably the most complicated in terms of music playback and live record. There's one at the beginning of the movie where there's a wedding, and both Keanu and Alex were performing like wild stallions, their performance that was dedicated to Missy, their shared mom, who's now marrying their brother, one of their brothers. And so they started describing all this music stuff that they were going to do, and it was going to involve, originally it was supposed to be music playback, which is, okay, well, that's easy enough. Then just hit space bar on the thing, make sure that everybody can hear it, and they'll just kind of pretend, that they're playing this thing. But then once we started talking to Keanu and Alex, it was like, we're thinking that we're actually going to play this stuff. It's like, all of a sudden I'm thinking like, okay, like what are we going to do here? Like when you say play it, like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, Keanu's going to play the bagpipes, and I'm going to do this throat singing thing. And so I'm like, okay, so a mic for the bagpipes, a mic for the throat singing, and then he's like, and then Keanu's going to play the theremin. So I'm like, okay, a hard line for the theremin. I'm like going through as they're like listing all these instruments and stuff. And I'm like, okay, so we need to have like 12 microphones out there, as well as having, them do their dialogue to, their speech to their parents and all this stuff. And so it just turned into this, massive sort of thing where, and then they're wearing bow ties in the scene too. So I'm like, well, I can hide a lav for them in their bow ties, and then we'll have the boom, and then, and listing all these other mics. And it actually turned out to be really pretty simple, surprisingly. We did have a hard line to the theremin, so like when you hear him playing the theremin, it's actually him. And then they had a mic that they were a hardline mic that they were talking into. So basically just had a big snake that was like 100 feet long to my cart. So all the hardline instrument connections and the hardline mics went into that, fed that into my recorder. And for that job, I had the Sound Devices 788 as my primary recorder. And then for additional channels, I had a Mix Pre 10T. And so I plugged all the extra channels, for that stuff into that recorder and synced both of those, the time code together, and fed the output mix of that into the 788. So, they had all the tracks if they wanted to remix any of the live stuff. It was all on one recorder. And then there was a rough mix that I did that fed into the primary 788 recorder. And then any lavaliers that were needed for that scene were fed into the 788 via the electro receivers that I was using.
Okay. That sounds like a fun one.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. One of the other complicated ones, we did a scene where we were shooting at the Preservation Hall, which is a place in the French Quarter, and it's a venue where they do these jazz performances with the Preservation Hall Jazz Band primarily. It's very small. There's just like very lo-fi. There's just benches. There's no air conditioning, and it's just the amplification of the room and the instruments to perform for the audience. And in this situation, it was supposed to be Louis Armstrong playing with his band, and the daughters of Bill and Ted. They're trying to recruit historical musicians to help their parents, perform the song that's going to save time and space, essentially. And so they walk in, and Louis performing with his band and gets interrupted by these girls. And they said, well, we have the actual Preservation Hall Jazz Band members that are going to be his band, and we want them to play live. So in that scenario, I ended up using a stereo mic that was actually part of the venue, and it was used for when they record their performances. We tapped into that. It sounded great, so we used that. And then we used those Bumblebee headsets to feed the music, like basically a trumpet solo that was a pre-record. We fed that to the musicians via the Bumblebee headsets. And then because Louis, the character that plays Louis, was going to be turning his head 180 degrees from camera. We gave him an actual earwig. And so then the musicians were playing to the pre-record and just on top of it. And then the guy who's playing Louis Armstrong, he pantomimed his trumpet solo. So the recording of the band in the movie is actually that band playing.
Oh, nice. All right. Let's talk about Catgut Sound. So that's your company.
Yeah.
And you have a sound team.
Yep.
You've probably been working with these guys for a while. So when, for somebody maybe that wants to work for a company that, become a part of a sound team like that, what do you look for when it comes to a utility and a boom op? What kind of things and skills would you like them to have?
I think the most important thing to me is it's just to have a good attitude, to be somebody that's willing to learn and willing to do, put in the work, but also to have the attention to detail that is necessary, for me. I'm very OCD. I like things to be very clean and organized. I learned a lot of things from other people along the way. I have years of experience that have led me to do things the way that I do them. And I think somebody that's brand new to the industry, if they're willing to just understand that they can learn a lot in a short period of time from somebody like me or from my boom operator who has been at this as long or longer than me, it's a real advantage to them. But all it takes for us is just having a good attitude more than anything. You're interfacing with a lot of important people or people that are high up in studio positions or actors that are, A-list actors a lot of times. And so having a certain tact, I think, is the most important thing. If you don't know an answer to a question, I feel like I try to drive home that it's okay if you don't know the answer to the question, but if you lie or if you mislead them to thinking that the reason that you're doing something is something, you don't really know the answer to why it is that you're doing that, and you kind of fabricate something to them, they're going to see that. They're going to see through that, and they're going to lose respect for you, and ultimately it's going to make it hard for us to do our job. So I think just being willing to not know everything and being open to just learning from other people is probably one of the most important things to me. Mm.
Now, when you're communicating with your sound team on set, what's your IFB setup?
We're using Electro R1As for the receivers for the crew. And I guess something that I learned from people that I had worked for in the past is that there could be a lot of times where there's important information being translated from your crew, whether it's the boom operator saying, hey, this is something that's happening on set, or like saying, this is the new slate for the scene that's coming up. It's like there's only a certain amount of time that you can spend on each different task. And if, for somebody like me, if I'm mixing and in between takes, if I were to leave the set and take my headphones off and lose communication with my crew, then I'm missing out on that information. So it's important for me to also be wearing an IFB whenever I'm not wearing my main headphones. That's something that I think benefits us, is that my crew can say something to me over the boom mic, or, my utility knows how to press the slate mic button, the comm button on my recorder, and they can communicate to me or to either of us at any point, and we know that we just trust that the other person is always listening, always keeping one ear of your headphones in, even if you're having a conversation with somebody, so that you don't miss information. And then something more recently that I've kind of adopted from some other people that I thought was a really smart idea is that my utility person also wears a transmitter and has one of those referee style electro on-off switches. And so if at any point we ask her a question, she can just flip the switch and respond to us, and we know that she's either on it or it's like, hey, can you go grab this thing from the trailer? And she can say, yeah, I'm on it. Or if she's having trouble finding it, she can be like, I'm looking for it, I don't see it, stuff like that, which I think is a real time saver.
Now, your boom op, is he communicating through the boom?
Yes.
Okay. And
actually, something more recently, too, especially with COVID, there's been a lot of talk of people basically monitoring offset. For example, a producer may be, in a hotel room or something, and they're just monitoring through the internet, Zoom call. So something that kind of occurred to me recently is that by using the boom mic to communicate between my boom op and me, That means that what he's saying is now not only going over the airwaves to anybody that's listening on, an IFB, but also to anybody from the studio that could be watching via Zoom. So having the new Scorpio, the Sound Devices Scorpio, because of the channel count that it has, I've actually started, and also it has this feature where you can assign one input to multiple faders. So something that's really great for me is that I have my primary boom fader that will go up during a take, as it should. And then when we're in between takes, I'll pull that fader down and I'll use either a plant mic that's just somewhere on the set, because I think that script supervisors and people still like to be able to put their headphones on and hear the set, just hear things that are going on, and they can kind of still gather information that way. If you were to pull the boom away completely, they get nervous. But what I've done is now I'll bring that fader up for the plant mic so they can still hear the set. And I bring the boom fader down, and then I have another fader that's still that boom mic, but it's not going to the public line. It's just going to our headphones. Yeah, and so I started using that. And then one thing that's been kind of cool is because I started realizing, I've still got all these faders that are being unused. So I started dialing in music, the walkie-talkie, if I want to be able to hear that, or if we want to hear, all three of us can hear what's going on the walkie channel, stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice, keeping everybody communicating well.
Yeah.
All right. You also worked on 12 Years a Slave.
Yeah, I did. I started out as a sound utility on that. There was a mixer that came to New Orleans named Kirk Francis. He's kind of a legend, and, the people that know him as kind of an interesting guy. He's probably one of the most unique characters that you'll have ever met that's worked in sound. He came to work on that movie, and he brought a boom operator named Bob Jackson, and he needed a local utility person. And I got hired to do that. After working with him on that for a while, they had several days where we had to do some second unit stuff or sound effects recording throughout the shoot, and he put me in charge of doing that stuff. At the end of the movie, I ended up getting a second unit mixer credit on that, as well as utility.
Nice.
That was really my first job where I got a sound mixer credit.
Okay. With Kirk Francis, you guys actually became pretty good friends after that?
Oh, yeah. He's become my mentor over the years. He came back to work on Jurassic World in New Orleans. He hired me again, and we got even closer. After retiring, he moved to Hawaii. I've gone with my wife to visit him, stay at his house in Hawaii, and we talk at least once or twice a week, either phone calls or email.
Now, was there one thing or a few things that he mentored you on that kind of changed your whole perspective on everything?
Yeah, I think the funny thing is, the first time I worked with him, one of the first tasks that I was given was to receive the equipment that was being transported to Louisiana. And he had it all palletized, which is basically where you get a wooden pallet that comes in, and it's like all these cases are stacked on top of each other, and there's this saran wrap that's going around everything, and it's just basically a big block of equipment. So I get to the stages where the gear was coming in, and I had, my pocket knife and everything, and I'm starting to open up all these saran wrapped blocks of gear, and as I'm pulling it out, it's the first time I'm going to see what this guy's using to record. He had done all these amazing movies. He had an Oscar for doing the Bourne films, Bourne Ultimatum, I think is the one he got an Oscar for. And I'm opening up all this saran wrap expecting to see the fanciest of everything, and it's okay, that's an acoustic guitar. And then I put that aside, and it's okay, that's another acoustic guitar. And then it's there's a guitar amp, and I'm where's the sound gear? I'm where's all the stuff that we use to record this stuff? And then eventually we got to that, but it was the first time I had seen somebody that managed to have an amazing career and, have all these accolades for the quality of work that he was providing, but with essentially the most minimal setup I had ever seen. He had a Kantar. I think it was the X1 and the X2. The X2 was his primary, and the X1, I think, was the backup. He had these cases full of Lectro 411 receivers in every single block. He had 2 of every block. And so his cart was basically kind of like mine. I learned that the Magliner was a great setup for that. And he would, since he was traveling, it folded up pretty compactly, and then you build it up, and then you just have a bunch of Pelican cases you stick on it, and then he would sit the Kantar on top of that, and he'd say he's got a funny way of talking. So if you don't know anything about him, it may not make sense. But he's like, "Kid, go over there and grab a 411 receiver for me." And I'm like going through the case, grab a 411. I'm like, "Which one?" He's like, "Get the pink one." Which is like, I think block 28 or something. He's like, none of the gear is referenced by model numbers. It's all like, get the little blue thing that makes the nerds happy. And it's like, oh, okay, the Denicky time code box, That's kind of how he worked. Yeah, it was interesting. And then whenever we would have shutdowns, it's Louisiana and it rains a lot. And when it rains, it usually brings lightning, which will shut us down. So I'm a musician by nature. I play saxophone. And when he learned that, he was like, bring one of those saxophones with you to set. And I was like, oh God, this is going to be embarrassing. So I did, though. And you can't say no to him. That's another thing, is this, you're just like, okay. And so we got shut down one day for a rain, for lightning. And he's got his slide guitars and stuff, and he's playing all these different songs, and he's like, go get the saxophone. And so I started playing. Next thing you know, we've got a crowd at the back of our trailer, and it was just kind of an interesting experience. But I learned a lot from him on kind of how to not take this business so seriously and not take myself so seriously, which is kind of one of the hardest things for me, I think. Is, he's like, you need to lighten up, kid, and you smile, stuff like that. Stop being so German, as he says to me. He's like, and anybody who's listening to this is probably, at least able to hear, like, my tone tends to be a little mono.
That's funny. Man. Yeah, and I hear you also have an espresso machine on your card or sound trailer?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have an espresso Pixie. We use that quite a bit. Craft services usually has coffee and espresso, but it's a little nicer when you can just kind of go to your trailer. And I got these little mugs that I use the Brother P-Touch label maker, and we have our names on our little espresso mugs. And it's kind of like a nice little treat at the end of after lunch. A little pick me up and something to just kind of make it feel a little special.
Yeah, my wife is originally from Brazil, and so when I'm working from home or whatever, she'll say I'm doing an interview, she'll bring me a little espresso, so I always appreciate that. Now, you also do some work in VR, so how'd you get started with that?
I got a job working on a show called Night Watch, and it was basically some EMTs, fire department, and NOPD, New Orleans Police Department, that they would, from the point when the sun would set to the time when the sun would rise, the show basically followed those different departments and, and sort of things that they would encounter in New Orleans during those hours. After working on that show, I did a few weeks on it, and I guess since I was kind of the new person, they had this crew that was coming out to do, it was like a Dick Wolf kind of an ancillary thing that was going to come in and do this VR shoot. And I think nobody really knew what that meant. So they kind of said, well, Chris, why don't you go do that? Because I was kind of the new person. And so I went with this crew not really knowing what to expect. They basically, instead of using the big handheld cameras, I don't remember what models they were using on the show, but, this group was using these little miniaturized cameras that were made of GoPros. And it's like they had a little enclosure that held like maybe 6 GoPros in this weird kind of spherical array. And they were mounting them to the front of the ambulance, and inside of the ambulance, they had a few, kind of stereoscopic setups and things like that. And so I'm like meeting all these people and trying to figure out well, what is it that I'm supposed to do? I've never done this before. And they kind of explained to me that it's virtually the same as what I would normally do for the show, but even more so, we're going to have the difficulty of not being seen because this camera is going to see in all directions. And so, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to hide somewhere, we're going to show up at a location when there's a call, and then we have to get out of the ambulance and basically hide. So it's like, everything's pretty much wireless, except I have a hardline boom, and I'm trying to think of how can I use the boom to do anything, to help this kind of shoot. I essentially thought, they had a little camera that was on a tripod, and they would run out when we would land somewhere. They would run out and they would set this tripod with the cameras on it, and they would use this little clicker thing that you would use to like train a cat or something. And it was like, that was their slate essentially. So you'd see them clicking the button and you'd hear the little sound, and that would be their sync point. And so I thought, well, let me put I have an extra lavalier. Let me just mount that onto that little tripod thing, and at least you'd have a mono source for the audio that would be from that perspective. And so essentially, you would be able to, when watching this content, you'd be able to look around with like a VR headset or something, or on YouTube, you'd be able to kind of hold your phone up and move it around in that space while you're sitting around watching this thing, and you could see 360 degrees around you. I was curious to see, like, what is it that, what does this look like? And they had a pair of goggles that they said, here, sit down on this case. And, you sit down because you don't want to, you put these things on, you might like fall over. Sit on this thing and just kind of, watch this little video. So I did that, and I was like, this is pretty cool. I've never seen something like this. So it just kind of intrigued me, and I was curious to know, like, well, I hadn't heard how sound was being used for this yet. And so I felt like I was kind of getting a unique opportunity to experience like working in this kind of new medium. And after looking into it, a few years later, it seemed like companies were starting to really make products that were catering to this kind of work. Sennheiser makes the Ambio VR mic. And so I was like, well, this makes much more sense. Instead of having like one microphone that's a mono source, it would be really cool to be able to kind of shift that sound around as you're looking. So I looked into the VR mic. I got one of those and then just started experimenting with it. I was like, well, this is kind of an interesting thing, because as a sound person, you almost have a better opportunity to go out and shoot VR content yourself, as opposed to the opposite, where like a camera person trying to do sound, I feel like the sound usually is compromised in those kinds of situations. So I got excited about it, thinking like, you could basically create your own content as a sound person that could be pretty interesting. So I ended up getting a 360 camera, just exploring the possibilities with that. And it's really neat. It's a lot more post-production oriented, because you have these opportunities to, if you have characters in your setting that you want speaking, you can kind of place plant mics, or you can put lavaliers on those people. And then in post-production, you can essentially have those characters moving around in a 360 environment where the viewer can then not only see where they are in front of them and like have them moving around them, but you can map their voice to their image. So really immersive, and it's just kind of an interesting concept that I think has a lot of potential moving forward.
Okay. Do you do a lot of work in that, or is that just an area of interest for you?
It's primarily an area of interest more than anything. I mean, I've seen a lot of people. There's a guy named Ben Adams that he seems to be very big into the VR sound world. And I think he gets a lot of like the bigger high profile jobs through Facebook 360 and things like that. So I see him kind of getting traveled all over the world, going to like, live concerts and things like that, which I guess, I'm not sure how that's been affected by COVID, but before that, it seemed like it was really taking off. You could be at an NBA game and you could be experiencing it, from your living room and feel like you're there.
Yeah, that's cool. How did you get started in production?
Well, I went to school for music media, and originally I thought I was going to be a composer. So I kind of went the route of music school, essentially. And then after I graduated college, the guy that was my counselor in college, he recommended me to a video production house in town that was looking for an in-house composer. And I thought, oh, this is great. Like, you couldn't ask for anything more, a job doing that, like right out of college. My dad thought I was going to be one of those musicians in the French Quarter that had his hat on the ground. And so he was pretty excited to see that I got a job doing this right out of school. And so was I. But at the time, it felt like they didn't have the amount of work to really justify having somebody doing composing, full time. So I had to basically earn my keep there beyond just doing the music stuff. So they taught me a lot about cameras. They had me shooting some video stuff at the time and doing a lot of animation, post-production stuff, editing, voiceovers and doing commercials and things like that. So I learned a pretty good amount of just the overall of how to do video production, including, the sound part. My grandmother at the time, who lived in New Orleans, she was getting all these newspaper articles popping up that were saying how the film industry was really becoming a big thing in New Orleans. And, as any grandmother really would, she was like, I want my grandkid to come back and be close to home. So she started sending me these newspaper clippings, and it was like talking about how they need all these, professionals in the industry. Eventually I got the idea, well, let me go back home after, Katrina happened. And it was like, a lot of people really, my family kind of needed, me to be closer and help out and stuff like that. So I gave it a shot and moved down here. And it was really like the early stages of the film industry in New Orleans as far as like the bigger boom and the incentives kind of taking off. So I was just in the right place at the right time with, I think, the perfect amount of experience to take advantage of that. And I was willing to do whatever, to get into the film industry. I was waiting tables at the time, and a friend of mine who was a hostess, she was in school and she was interning for a casting company. And I guess she had heard that they had a DJ for this party scene for a movie called College, the Movie. And the DJ for this scene, I guess he didn't like what he was wearing, what they had put him in. And so he just walked off the set. And so now they're about to shoot this party scene and they have no DJ. And so I guess the costume department was like, I don't know, maybe she was being really ambitious, and she's like, I know a guy who's a DJ. I'll call him and see if he's available. And so she called me up, and I was just laying on the couch, watching TV or something. And she's like, do you want to be in this movie? And I was like, what do you mean? What does that mean? And she's like, well, we need a DJ. And I was like, okay. So, I have no idea what to expect. She's like, get your turntables, get your mixer, bring them over here, and they'll put you in the movie. And I was like, okay, I'll try this out. And so I was like, when do I need to be there? And she's like, in like 30 minutes. And I'm thinking, my turntables and my mixer are all set up in my house. Like, this is going to take me 30 minutes just to tear it apart and put it in my car. She's like, just do it. Just whatever it takes, just like, get here as fast as you can. So I did. And of course I get there and I'm like waiting for hours. I'm like, I thought I had to be here, in this big rush. Anyway, in waiting on the set, they had me basically sitting on the front porch of this house, and I'm like watching all these people carrying sandbags and C-stands and cameras, and I'm like, this is pretty cool. Everybody's nice, and and there's like snacks everywhere and like things like that. So I'm like, I'm just curious, like, how do you keep doing this? Like, I need to turn this into something more than this one thing. And I just talked to whoever I could on that set, and I was like, inquisitive, and I guess they thought I was friendly enough. So it turned out I got offered a job a week later as a production assistant in the office on a movie. It was a movie called Bolden, which, funny enough, it finally came out, but I think they ended up making this movie like 3 times. It was like somebody who was like the heir to the Boeing family or something like that he just had this passion project of telling the story of Buddy Bolden, a trumpet player from New Orleans. And so anyway, I got this job as an office PA, and that led to another office PA position, to another one. And I knew that ultimately I wanted to do something in sound with this. And I guess being in that position as an office PA, it really put you in contact with a lot of the department heads from the movies. When I got a phone call one day from, this guy who was the sound mixer on a TV show, he called the office and he's like, I'm having this emergency, like this cable broke and I need this particular thing. And I was like, oh, I know what that is. And he's like, okay, but like it needs to be this particular cable and it needs to come like overnighted from this company. I'm like, I got you. I know exactly what you're talking about. And so he's like, how do you know that? And I was like, well, I used to do sound like for blah, blah, blah. So next thing I know, he had a need. Somebody on his crew quit on him. He called up the producers from the show and he's like, I'm having an emergency and like I really need an extra hand. Do you think we can take Chris from the production office and bring him out to help out? And I was like, yeah, go ahead. I'm sure the producers like thinking we just need to get through this. You can't have everything go down because this guy's crew quit on him. So they send me out, and I'm excited to be there and everything. And, he essentially gave me every reason to think that, like, you're in. This is it. We're going to get you in the union. We're going to do, I had all the days from all that previous stuff that I had done at the video production place. It's like, great. I'm doing it. This is awesome. And I got my first paycheck, and I was like, this is amazing. Like, this is like, I'm making what I made as a PA in a week, I'm making in a day. This is amazing. Cut to, the guy got fired. It was like, that lasted about a week. But luckily, he got me into the union. And then from there, I just basically just called everybody I could, wrote emails when I heard of movies coming and stuff like that. And I was like selling myself as, somebody that's capable and willing to learn. And it just kept building from there.
Yeah. And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
That's pretty cool. I like that. It really, you hear those kind of stories over and over again. It's always when somebody's in a bad situation, somebody just quit, somebody, and you are there and you're ready and willing and then it goes from there.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other things that really jumped out to me too is like at that point I started thinking like, oh, okay, well, I guess my job title is sound utility. Like, and then, you see something like IMDb, you start looking up like who's doing what. You think about your favorite movies and you're like, who was a sound utility on, on this movie and then on this movie. And you start looking, from there you can see like what it is that they had done before they got to that movie that you thought was worth looking up in the first place. And it's like, I've never heard of any of these movies. It's like 20 credits before you finally recognize something like that. I started realizing that I was in a very unique place being in New Orleans at that time, because I feel like, if I look back at my IMDb credits, it's like, I might have had like 3 jobs before you recognize the first thing that's recognizable, So it's like, I felt like I got a real jump start on a really great career that I don't know how you do it that way anymore. In one hand, it's like the productions going to different states for tax incentive purposes is a real opportunity for a lot of people to have a kind of job and a career that can be very rewarding and can provide a lifestyle that can, give you a family and a place to live that you would hope for without the need to move to a big bustling city, So it's interesting.
Yeah. So we got to ask the question, what's been your worst on-set experience?
I'll go with the one that was probably the first scary thing that I dealt with on set. There's a movie called Red with Bruce Willis and Mary Louise Parker and Morgan Freeman. I got hired by a mixer who I'd worked for as a sound utility to do that show with him. It was the part of the movie that was being shot in New Orleans. So it was about 2 or 3 weeks worth of work. It wasn't the full movie, but it was, a substantial enough opportunity for me. He said, I wanted to see if you were available to boom for me on this movie Red. And I'm thinking, well, I haven't really boomed before. I was a sound utility for you before, and I know that I did boom, on occasions when it was necessary to have 2 booms, but I don't know if I feel really like I'm ready to take on that position. And I think it was more of a situation he needed somebody to do it. And so maybe he was more willing to kind of take me on and kind of train me up to do that position. So I said, well, as long as you feel like I'm capable, like that you know my experience level, if you feel like I can do it and you're willing to like help me through this, I'll do it. Sure, I'll give it a shot. So we ended up doing this job, and I remember thinking, like, I feel like I didn't really quite think about the scope of what I was about to step on to set to do, So first day I get out there, and I'm like, it really sets in when I step on, when I'm on set, and he's introducing me to the first AD, and I'm like, I'm probably feeling, like, I'm feeling awful, like in my inside, I'm just like a nervous wreck. And he's introducing me to all these different people, and I'm sweating, my hands are cold and all this stuff. And I'm like, just keep it cool. And so the first scene that we're about to shoot, I'm like working out my position for the boom mic and everything, and there's like mirrors in this location and stuff, and I'm like, just don't mess it up. Just don't mess it up. They had all these second team people that they were doing all the rehearsals with before they brought first team in. And finally they say, okay, we're ready to shoot and everything. And I realize all of a sudden now I'm standing in front of Morgan Freeman and Bruce Willis. And it's the first thing that I'm supposed to deal with. And also, I think part of the comfort that I was feeling is that, worst case scenario, we were going to put wires on these actors, and if I couldn't get something on the boom, we always have the safety net of the wires, or, we can mix, he's going to be mixing the boom and the wires together to get what he needs. And so the pressure is not all on me. And then all of a sudden it's like, go to wire Bruce Willis. And he's like, yeah, I'm not going to wear a wire. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is all going to fall on me. I have to capture like his dialogue or we don't have it. I don't know if it's the worst thing that has happened, because ultimately I did the job and I got through it, but it was the worst feeling that I had on a set, going into that sort of thing and thinking, he basically was like, I'm not wearing the wire, buddy, sorry. And I'm just like panicked, like, oh my God, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to wear the wire and then everything's going to be okay. I learned through that actors can be very finicky and they can make or almost break you. And you just have to kind of smile and, get through it and, be professional through those things.
Mm. So when you tell the mixer, hey, he doesn't want to wear a wire, what does he say?
Oh, he was like, he was livid. And I think he was thinking, well, this is how we were going to get through it with this inexperienced boom operator. So now all of a sudden it's like everything's really falling on me. And I think at some point he's like pulling out the longest shotgun microphone that he has, just so that when we're doing this wide shot that there's any chance of me getting, anything usable. But I mean, I saw the movie, it sounded fine. I have no idea what they had to go through, but I feel like we ended up getting it,
Nice. You said you had maybe another one in there?
Well, there was this one time where I was working on the set of a movie called The Killing of a Sacred Deer. And I was working as a boom operator on this project with a sound mixer named Jeff Maxwell. He has a lot of Shep's microphones. He's very proud of his collection, and rightfully so. And we tried to use these, all the different mics that he had for every situation that came up. And there was one particular scene that we were shooting where we were shooting a big wide shot, and one of the actors was walking up to the front of a house to approach one of the other characters who was inside, and he was expected to be yelling and screaming from the front of this porch. So, it was a big wide shot where we were seeing everything of the house. And so I decided, well, let me see about putting a plant mic out. And I found this perfect spot. There were these little plants actually hanging from the rafters of this porch. And so I got the idea, well, let me plant one of these mics in the plant, and it ended up working out really well. We had, it was one of the Shep's CMC6 with the, it actually had like the GVC on it and 41 capsule. And I had positioned it, to where it was just right inside this hanging fern in the front of this house. And everything sounded great. And a funny side story with this is that they had all these people in the neighborhood that were really excited to see this movie being made in their neighborhood. And it was probably right around 5 o'clock at night. And so people were coming home, and it was like the whole neighborhood came out with their kids. The golden retrievers were all sitting out in front of the houses and things. And if you see the scene, it's pretty interesting, because the dialogue was very inappropriate for kids. So they were all lined up to see take one. They all pretty much scattered after they heard what he was saying. I won't ruin it for you, but check out the movie. It's pretty funny. So everything sounded great, and they were like, great, moving on. We're going to go into a medium shot. And so for us, really nothing was going to change sound-wise. So I decided, well, we have probably 10, 15 minutes. I went to Crafty, came back ready for the next take. And, they say roll sound, and all of a sudden the mixer, he brings the faders up, and it's just hiss, and it's like there's nothing. And I'm thinking, what the heck happened? All of a sudden I look up and I see that the plants were dripping with water. And I'm like, what the hell happened? This is, I'm freaking out now. And I'm sure he's like, what's going on? Something's not right with the mic. I go up to him and I'm like, the plant, I'm just panicked. I'm having to basically explain to him, like, I think somebody watered these plants. So turns out the homeowner, he came home while we were shooting to water his plants in his house. And he just went up to, while we were in the middle of shooting the scene, he just went up to all the different plants that he does every night and filled them up with water. And unfortunately, that was right where our microphone was. And I go and, try to collect it at the end of the take. And it's dripping with water. So that was pretty awful. And having to explain to the UPM why there's a completely dead CMC6 with the 41 capsule and all that, and the price attached to that was pretty painful.
All right, let's see. Well, if you could go back to the beginning of your career, in sound, what would you do differently? Anything?
I don't know if I'd do anything differently, really. I mean, I think I feel very grateful for where I've gotten, in my career. I think it's all been based on relationships that I've had. Any of the places where I maybe was lacking in experience or in knowledge, I've made up for through building personal relationships with people that have been able to share that experience and their knowledge with me and kind of get me up to a speed that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. I mean, they don't teach a lot of what we do in school. So it really takes being somebody that you can stand to be around for 14 hours a day, 6 sometimes days a week for months on end, So yeah, I can't really think of anything that I would necessarily do differently, but I think I'm grateful for the opportunities that were given to me along the way. And I think a lot of it comes down to just being willing to do anything that's necessary, to get the job done and to have the kind of go-getter personality type to, just always push forward, don't give up when things get hard. And that's about it.
All right. Now, if people wanted to find out more about you or connect with you online, what's the best way to do that?
I suppose Instagram has been one of the ways that I've used to kind of put things out into the ether. So hit me up on Instagram at catgutsound. You can also check out my website at catgutsound.com. There are several Facebook groups that I subscribe to. There's the JW Sound group. There's Freelance Sound Mixers Forum. And I actually started a few groups on Facebook myself that have been pretty good. One of them is the Dante for Location Sound Mixers group. And then there's a new one that I started recently that's all about location sound equipment maintenance.
Cool. Well, Chris, I want to say thanks for being on the podcast. We appreciate you sharing your sound journey with us. All right, this is Chris Welcker. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you're looking for more audio-related podcasts, here's what some of our friends in the podcasting community have in store for you.
Hi all, this is Becky and Susan from the Sound Girls podcast, where we speak to audio professionals from all walks of life. Join us Tuesdays at 9 a.m. and listen to the amazing array of sound humans talk about how they got into the biz. And a few cool things, like roadie nicknames and fizzy water preferences.
You can find the Sound Girls podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as our website, soundgirls.org.
Immersive Audio Podcast, a podcast that explores all things immersive audio. We talk to thought leaders covering the art, science, and business of this fast-changing industry. We aim to inform, educate, explore, and unite the community. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app.